Rafael is also here. Welcome, Rafael.
Hello, hi.
Hi.
Hi, Rafael. Good to see you.
You too. Thank you for your invitation.
With great pleasure.
As I see everybody's here, we are already live on Facebook. So I will just make a quick introduction. I wish you all a warm welcome to our second web webinar in this edition of Academia in Dialogue with the title of Rise of the Far Right and Identity Politics, Southeast European Experiences, which we as the Friedrich Ebert Foundation Dialogue Southeast Europe organized together with our partners from the Institute for Democratic Engagement Southeast Europe, Gazela Podar-Draško and Vedran Džihić. In the last web seminar on Monday, and first in this series, we spoke about post-ideological politics and the constant fights over definitions and classification of different ways of doing politics, so to say. One of the conclusions was that the so-called far right, again, no matter how we define her, or better to say those regimes like the one in Hungary, Orban, and Turkey, Erdogan, Trump, cover themselves with a curtain of democracy, and that they all have together that they undermine the so-called liberal values, as we like to call them. In this second session with the title Between West and East, Right-Wing International in Southeast Europe, we want to discuss the international supply as an essential aspect of the far right in the region, or just to put it bluntly, we want to, among others, see in which way the region's far right is inspired by both West and East, and the other way around, in which way the region's far right influences their counterparts in the other regions of the world. So speakers and discutants in today's web seminar are Ana Devic from the Catholic University Leuven in Belgium, Jovo Bakic from the University of Belgrade, Kostis Karpozoulos from the Contemporary Social History Archives in Athens, Ivan Vejvoda from the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna, Nenad Radicevic, who is an editor and journalist covering topics related to foreign politics, and last but not least, Sasha Vasic, my colleague from the Friedrich Ebert Foundation Regional Dialogue Southeast Europe in Sarajevo. So welcome all, thank you for participating in our series. And to make it short, I would like now to give the word to our Director of Office, Dr. Ralph Melzer, who will also give a short overview of the last session and say a few introductory words, and then we will go on with the open discussion like we did last time. So thank you all, and Ralph, the floor is all yours.
Yeah, thank you very much, Harun. Welcome all of you also from my side. I actually don't want to summarize the first session on Monday. I would rather like to add some comments and to share with you a couple of impressions and conclusions I personally took from this first part. Also, as Harun said, as an introduction for our meeting today. What we did is we discussed a wide range of aspects, including the different framing and the different contexts and impacts of identity politics, depending whether it comes from the left or from the right. And as I think it was Vedran or Harun who pointed out at the beginning, the title was intended to be kind of provocative. I was particularly pleased to see that there was a kind of consensus among us, in the sense that we are not experiencing a post-ideological world. To the contrary. However, what has changed is how far-right ideologies appear, how they present themselves, and how they act, which brings us already to the topic of our web seminar today, when we are going to discuss the right-wing international, or as we could also name it, the internationalizing of nationalism. I think we have to understand that we are not only confronted with fragmentation of societies, but also with new ideological constructions and also coalitions. And clearly, if we were going to believe, for instance, the identitarians when they are claiming to be neither right nor left but identitarian, we would already fall into that trap. And similar to the way how right-wing extremist actors like the identitarians transformed old school racism into an ethno-pluralistic cultural racism that appears to be hip and modern and young, we also have to understand right-wing populism as a facet of exclusive identity politics. Yes, populism is first and foremost a political style and a method, but charged, so to say, with far-right content, right-wing populism is the method that is used to make right-wing extremist ideology connectable with the mainstream and acceptable in the middle of society, where authoritarian, anti-liberal, and racist attitudes always existed and still exist. And here again, and that brings me to the end of my short remarks, we are back at the phenomenon of a right-wing international that is, compared to former times, ideologically more flexible, but no less dangerous for liberal democracy. On Monday, we discussed how much liberal democracies are currently under pressure. And the more this is the case, the more I think we have to increase our efforts to defend universal values and rights, even though they are sometimes defamed as being imposed by the West. I would like to end here in order not to take too much time from our time today. And I leave now the floors for open discussion. In what extent political actors in Southeast Europe are already part of this right-wing international. Yeah, thank you very much again to all of you for joining us today. And now I'm very much looking forward to the inputs and discussions. But first I hand over to Vedran for further moderation.
So thank you so much, Ralph, for basically, as we have a changing setup of people to a certain degree, but as we underlined in the first session, so we will produce a summary and a report on this first effort of understanding and digging deeper into the issue of far right, and share it not only with all of you that participate and will participate on Friday, but also with a wider audience. In any cases, we now move to this kind of a second set of questions. In the first sessions, we also had some kind of a theoretical type of contemplation about the terms and ideology. Now we wanna move it to this question of right-wing international, or something that Boris Budin has described as right-wing fascist or pro-fascist international. And this time we decided that Ghazala is going to take the lead in moderating, and as usual, we would like to have short inputs from your perspectives, 5 to 7 minutes, just in order to get enough time later on for discussion. So Ghazala, the Zoom is yours.
Well, thanks a lot. I'm sorry. Firstly, I want to apologize because I was not present in the first session on Monday due to objective reasons. I was at the court being sued by one person who is, let's say, far right wing, but that is a struggle in practice, let's say. And thank you very much, Ralph, and also Vedran, for getting us into this topic by saying what was happening during that session. Today we have several speakers, and Harun already named them. I don't want to prolong anymore because we already had some input. I would like to proceed with Anna, who is named as the first. I know Anna through my colleague Milivoje, and he was saying many things about her as a person to whom we must cooperate at some things. So I'm really happy to see her in person here and in person via these technological tools, and to hear a little bit more about what she can say about this topic, which is really her topic. Anna, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Gazela. Thank you for your kind words. At least we know who is to be responsible. So I just want to first say how I came to be interested in this topic. 2 years ago, I became part of a project that was financed by the OSCE office in Belgrade, and they wanted to do something on violent extremism. It was funded by the British Council, and the money was distributed through the British Embassy in Belgrade. And when the coordinator gathered relevant proposals that she chose, first of all, it turned out that it was very difficult to sell what some of us wanted to do as research, because according to the standard that was presented, the call for applications, right wing, apparently the term right wing was something that belonged to the realm of the West, but what was in the East, it was to be Islamic terrorism. And so first of all, it was very difficult to convince the OSCE office that it was something. In my case, I was interested in doing the links between the Serbian and Russian far-right groups. So it was something that the coordinator later told us, okay, they let us do it this time, but I don't think that they would ever invite me to be a coordinator again. So this is funny, but it is also quite sad, and to see that there exists quite a huge ideological wall against actually perceiving something that is going on behind these new right wing or far right radicalism. And I just want to start by saying that fascism, also in a way that Boris Buden used it, I think it's very important, and this is what is guiding me conceptually and in my research, that fascism is a normalized form of nationalism. I am paraphrasing Todor Kulic, Belgrade sociologist. And it also very much informs the method that I'm using as a sociologist. So I would just like to say a few words about this research that I conducted on the Serbian-Russian transnational links. And I was interested, of course, to start with some kind of a beginning point. And so I traced back the new links between Serbia and Russia to the beginning of the 90s. And the era of Milosevic, going then all the way to the current period. And the second period that I kind of looked together with a different set of topics is the period after 2000, with new academic and para-academic and activist links between the far right in the two countries. Separately, I also looked at the joint patterns of violent and potentially violent radical activism. Among the, now just to mention the ideological field, there are several themes, and I would just mention two main themes that span all these decades, starting from the 90s. And these are, first of all, the threat of the unipolar post-Cold War order, where this threat is represented as the menace coming from the US, NATO, and the EU. And this threat of is apparently corrupting and destroying some genuine, first of all, some genuine national cultures, the one in Russia, the one in Serbia, and also is threatening what is perceived as the historical alliance, brotherly affinities between Serbs and Russians. And the second main theme is about protecting Serbia's territorial integrity, where Russia is portrayed as a natural, stronger partner, and where also it draws this partnership from the allegedly unchanging primordial and historical affinities. So what I wanted to do with this study was to define and somehow to measure the political weight of the right-wing extremism in the wider context of Serbian, and to some lesser degree, because I still didn't do enough research on Russia itself, to some degree also in the wider context of Russian nationalism. Unlike to what would be considered as a preferred method in conducting a similar study of voters and or sympathizers of the radical right in sociological terms in Western Europe, in Serbia or Russia, I decided that it may not be the best tool to figure out the political potential of these groups, just to look at, let's say, surveys that look at which social strata these voters or sympathizers begin. I decided against this at this point, and instead I was primarily interested in the positioning of the relevant stakeholders, the state, the political parties, the Orthodox Church, the military, and also prominent cultural institutions, let's say some strongholds of intellectual institutional life. So I traced very briefly the beginnings of the active Russian interest in Serbia to the endeavors of a prominent Russian historian and international relations specialist, whose name is Yelena Guskova. And she served, and this is the beginning of her active interest in the region, she served as an expert in Zagreb during the war in Bosnia-Herzegovina in the office of the UN Special Envoy. She made frequent field trips to Bosnia-Herzegovina, and this is where her unyielding public support and also her close personal friendship with people such as Radovan Karadzic, Ratko Mladic, Vojislav Šešelj, and today it sort of came down to the close friendship and support for Milorad Dodik. The second tier of the Russian ideological concentration in Serbia came later in the face of Alexander Dugin. I think Katerina mentioned him last time. And so Alexander Dugin is known as a creator of the notion of Eurasian geopolitics. In a way, he hijacked the notion of Eurasianism from a much earlier interest of Russian ethnologists and historians from the beginning of the 20th century. And he first came to Belgrade in 2008 and as an invited speaker to a conference at the University of Belgrade. And 10 years later, after he was already coming more frequently, he established a summer school, a series of workshops at a private university in Belgrade. He often comes with an entourage of his intellectual assistants. In the meantime, he was fired from the post of a professor of sociology in Moscow after students complained about his warmongering and hate speech against Ukrainians. And so it was quite remarkable that they actually were able to chase him out from his post due to the organized protest. Now, In his numerous speeches and already in the numerous interviews that Dugin started giving, first to some more marginal and then later to more mainstream media in Serbia, he in a way pursues a seemingly paradoxical line of who is there to support in Serbia from the Russian side, something very similar to what Jelena Guskova is doing. So Aleksandar Vučić is considered to be the one who is selling Kosovo. So on the one hand, he's a bad guy. On the other hand, both Dugin and Guskova, they continue supporting all the efforts that Putin is providing to the Serbian ruling elites as something that is absolutely necessary to guarantee first of all, the internal legitimacy of the Serbian regime. So there is this constantly simmering paradox that, well, it survives. And in one of these interviews already 5 years ago, the members of Dugin's entourage spoke very openly and with much praise about how they were hosts, how they welcomed numerous Serbs who were staying in their homes on the way to fighting in Donbass, in the Donetsk self-proclaimed republic. So second, I'd like to say that there are also links between the radical right movements that have counterparts in both Serbia and Russia. And I've just mentioned two groups. One was started in Serbia. It's called Obraz, or Honor, and it was banned after the violence they incited during the 2011 Pride parade in Belgrade. Then later they regrouped, they suffered virtually no sanctions, they reorganized. And the second one is Nashi, or, well, you would translate it, our guys, our folks. And they also have, they actually started in Russia, and then the counterpart was created in Serbia. They plan and they do numerous trips to Russia. In one of their trips that was organized and lasted for several days, they visited many churches, monasteries. They also visited a camp near the main Russian Orthodox pilgrimage site, where there are training camps that are held on church grounds, but there is military personnel that actually conducts this training. And so the Serbian Nashi were so much in awe of what they saw, and they learned that there are 3,000 such camps in Russia. So they kind of they vowed that they would organize something similar back home. What's interesting also to mention about the Russian part of Nashi is that they are a registered youth organization, and they're financed by the Russian Federal Agency of Youth that still has the name from the Soviet times, Rosmolodezh. It is state funded, and it's officially endorsed by the presidency in Russia. And there is, of course, the more recent one group in Serbia that's called Zavetnici, or Oath Bearers. They also take pictures with Russian ambassadors. They're also paid to travel in Russia. And now, just to finish, I would like to say that one of the main reasons of the smooth cooperation between the radical right in Serbia and Russia lie in what I would say is the shared political and social context of liberties. They can situate and instrumentalize their connections to, and here I want to say that I don't just mean here liberties in ideological terms. They can instrumentalize their operation to their connections and support of such legitimate and long-time groups such as sports fan clubs and similar organizations, which have continuous access to relevant state resources. And I would also like to say in the end that violent activities that they conduct, from interrupting film screenings about the Serbian war crimes of the 90s, beating or launching racist slurs against Roma or African American soccer players during matches, all the way to volunteering in the Donbas war, they stem from the fact that these groups are fully aware of the protracted proceedings in Serbian courts that often end in acquittals, and such is the example of 28 men who were actually charged with violating the state law that prohibits Serbian citizens from participating in the wars outside of in foreign armies. But none of these people have been actually convicted. Many of them deserve they get some conditional sentence, and in some cases it happens that they go again to Donbas. So this really tells you about how much supervision there is for these verdicts. It's a completely different story about the verdicts that are made against the people who fight in Syria. And so there is even a different legal term for that. So there is a relaxed approach on the part of the judiciary. There is a frivolous, if not completely silent, treatment of these groups on the part of mainstream political parties. And so this explains why Serbia, and this is where I'm finishing, it has become an attractive destination not only for the links with Russia, but also for far-right groups from Western Europe, ranging from the intellectuals from the AfD, the Alternative for Germany, and also main spokesperson for at the rallies of the Pegida. And so they actually came as invited lecturers to such institutions as Matica Srpska, which is the oldest Serbian institution since the Austrian times of literary culture, and also numerous other xenophobic and anti-immigrant groups from Britain, Greece, and Italy. And I'm done at this point.
Thanks, Latana. This was very insightful and rich, I would say, presentation about right-wing groups, but also about the context. And I think that what you pointed out in the end is really relevant for the Western Balkan and Southeast Europe, having in mind specificities of Serbia in the wider framework of the countries here. I was myself thinking about this specificity, which is resembling somehow, and you pointed out that the Russian context, having in mind what was happening in Montenegro, for example, and how it was possible to have such happening in Montenegro during elections, which is for us living in Serbia very, very difficult to imagine that could happen here, and why actually is something which you pointed out why. With all these contextual aspects. I wouldn't follow the list which we have in the program now. Unfortunately, Jovo Bakic, who should join us today and speak a little bit about his opinion and his thoughts. He was writing recently about right-wing in Western Europe. He will not join us during the personal reasons. I'm sure that you have seen his email, but I would like actually to go now to Germany and to talk a little bit to Nenad, speaking a little bit because he was writing about German influences in Southeast Europe. So I think in parallel with Russian, I think it would be interesting to hear how do you see actually German influence, having in mind already that Anna said that there is Pegida, there is AfD who is trying to play here also. So.
Yes, thanks. Actually, this quote, Boris Buden's quote, is from my last year's investigation about networking between a German far right and their Serbian and Croatian counterparts. But basically, when I investigated those kind of networks, it's obvious that contrary to widely held perception in the West of the Balkans as a source of ethnic nationalism and instability that can endanger Europe, recent years we have seen the emergence of reverse trend that somehow Germany is in a way exporting far-right ideology, or not just Germany, but Austria as well, or to the countries of the Balkans. And basically, when I investigated those kind of networking, I saw the main 3 points of these cooperation, basically with Serbia and Croatia, and the 3 points are anti-migration narrative, then Islamophobia and historical revisionism. Of course, there are more other points like gender and identity politics, multiculturalism, globalism, but those three are, in my opinion, the main points and the main focus for German far right when they come to Serbia and Croatia, and not just Serbia and Croatia and Bosnia as well, but only to Serbs and Croats in Bosnia. Of course, Bosniaks are not acceptable as a partners for them, especially because this Islamophobic character of their narrative. And as the targets, as they have several targets and not just politicians, usually, and in my investigation, maybe the main focus is on networking among politicians, but they're very clearly focused on church figures, church representatives in diaspora and in Serbia and Croatia, and intellectuals. That networking among right-wing intellectuals or even far-right, clearly far-right intellectuals was totally surprised for me. I didn't see that in mainstream media, not even in mainstream media at all. It in a media environment, you don't see those kind of conferences and gatherings, and where they exchange clearly far right narrative, and that they are not even in some kind of conspiracy or in they are not hidden. They promote themselves on Facebook or pages, so they are proud of it. After, well, now I have a year distance from that investigation, despite the fact that I monitored them still. It's clearly that somehow they're more successful in online environment than in offline environment, and that their cooperation is more on in social media networks and in those kind of things than in a real offline, despite the fact that they have gatherings and you can see some far right members of Serbian Croatian far right groups in gatherings in Budapest, in Prague, or in Germany, but still I think that they are more in online environment. And in a way, Southeastern Europe, or we can say Balkans, is a bit different than many other parts of Europe when we speak about creating of a right-wing international. In the Balkans, in my opinion, the mainstream elites, or so-called moderate conservative or social democratic elites, are very often using far-right narrative or using proxy far right groups. In their regular political life, we could see that in Serbia on last protest after the elections, that some far right groups are used by, obviously, by the government. So the creation of right-wing international in the Balkans is obviously possible only with at least silent approval of the mainstream parties or local governments. In that way, that kind of cooperation are not so big. When you see, for example, cooperation between AFD and for example, Serbian parties. We saw that they started very small parties and individuals, then creating cooperation with bit bigger opposition parties like Dveri. And at the end, they are focused since last year on the government, and we can see that AFD and their deputy and head of party's Foreign Affairs Committee, Armin Paul Hampel, that he in 6 months he visited Belgrade, I think, twice or 3 times, and meeting firstly with SNS, with their deputies, and then with Marko Đurić as chief of Serbia's office for Kosovo. So we see that they want more, and somehow still they don't get it in a way as probably they wanted. But on the other hand, they are now, I think so, this year they're more focused on Balkan diaspora communities in Germany and Austria, and that's the battlefield for souls in Germany at the moment. Of course, with COVID crisis and with this rise of QAnon theories, anti-vax narrative, and so on, they're more focused on those kind of things than on politics. But basically, at the end, in my opinion, it seems that the real impact of those kind of networking of far right could be in the Balkans only when top politicians approve that in a way to accept that kind of cooperation. Maybe we can see that in a way in Republika Srpska, but still, especially regarding cooperation with Freedom Party from Austria. But after Ibiza Gate and everything fall apart. So we'll see what would happen.
Thanks a lot, Nana. This was really interesting to hear. Actually, you made me thinking about when you said there are many things which are happening which are not so visible and we don't know about, for example, influencing the church and making connections with the church and the right-wing conservative intellectuals. But it is still happening, and actually there is a...
Sorry, I interrupt you. For example, during investigation, I found out that there is Serbian True Orthodox Church, which is a small sect, and that they cooperate with neo-Nazi and NPD in Germany. And I was totally shocked because I think that I'm well informed, but I didn't know or those kind of links. Sorry.
No problem. Actually, that is interesting because church is not also monolith institution, and having in mind the different groups within the church, which is at least according to my knowledge, very, very present in Serbian Orthodox Church, but also maybe some other. And that is my entry point actually to Kostis, who already joined us for previous session when we were talking about radical politics, but not in this context. Actually, he was challenging this radicalism we were mentioning at that point. But having in mind that he's coming from Greece, where we have both present very strong Orthodox Church, but we also had parliamentary party, which was far right-wing party. It will be really interesting to see your position on this, and how do you observe internal processes in Greece, but also influences from a side to Greek society.
All right, thank you for this very generous introduction. It's a pleasure to be here. Well, first of all, I was thinking that the pandemic is a way to think again the connection between national responses and transnational links. How we are entering a new stage where national politics seem to matter. And I'm referring to the condition during the summer where the Balkan states would take measures against each other in order not to be not to experience the import of the virus. When it comes to the Greek far right, I think there are two eras. This is a very brief periodization. Until the 1990s, the connection of the Greek far right world would be Western Europe. And I think that we tend to forget that for several years, Greece appeared to be a successful paradigm of far right politics during the military junta of the 1960s, the anti-communist rhetoric, the idea of the border state resisting communism in the heart of the Balkans. So in my research, so often I have seen connections between the Italian neo-fascists of the 1970s, NAR and the armed struggle groups of that type coming to Greece in order to discuss with members of the Greek military junta and to find a world where they would think that there's room for their opinion. The turning point is the 1990s, and here I come to the Orthodox connection. And I think the war in Yugoslavia and the Greek participation, despite, it wasn't a huge participation, but the Greek popular support for the Serbian politics, for Serbia, and the involvement of a number of volunteers in the Yugoslav wars was the turning point for a new transnational connection, for a decisive shift from this Western dominated or Western influenced nationalism that goes back to the early 20th century, the cosmopolitan nationalists who would go, to Paris and come back, or to Spain or to Italy. And now we have a Balkan connection that is founded on the idea of religious, common religion, and the idea of a common struggle against both enemies, the Western influence now and what appears to be the distant East, but not so distant East, that is Turkey, or this Islam in a more general form. At this stage in Greece, during the rise of the Golden Dawn, there was this interest about international connections, and usually, we would pinpoint the connections to the German far right, and this is important. But I would dare to say that this was more of a symbolic kind of connection. Golden Dawn was a point of inspiration, and here you see the periphery influencing the center. Golden Dawn appeared to be a successful paradigm of neo-Nazi politics coming from a country that was witnessing an unprecedented crisis. But the organizational links between, let's say, the German neo-Nazis and the Greek neo-Nazis, I think, were confined to some visits, exchange of information, and a general sense of a discussion between true believers. At the same time, though, there was a stronger link that would connect, and here I agree with Anna, would connect Russia, Serbia, and Greece. Here you see an Orthodox, how we would call this, an Orthodox pipeline that goes both ways. Because I think one aspect of this discussion is that we do not have a one-sided street. It's not a highway where point A influences point B, but we have an exchange, a highway that works both ways. At this stage, if one was a very strict follower of Greek politics and Greek parliamentary politics, the Greek far right is in a crisis. In a month's time, in October, there will be a court ruling on the Golden Dawn. Golden Dawn is not anymore in the Greek parliament and is witnessing a number of internal ruptures and crises that make it obsolete. I cannot see in the foreseeable future a resurgence of the Golden Dawn in the way we have experienced. This does not mean that the far right agenda is out, is over in Greek politics. On the contrary, I have been thinking that we are witnessing a resurgence of far right rhetoric or extreme nationalist rhetoric that has an international and transnational component that relates to what seems to be a peripheral antagonism in this part of the world, that is the Greek-Turkish antagonism. It is a topic that in a way it is connected to what Nenad was mentioning, the refugee immigrant question, because of the flows from Turkey to Greece, the question of Islam, and the question of historical revisionism. And I will make, I'm a historian, so I cannot escape, the third component. I will make a brief reference to what I think is an alarming situation when it comes to far-right internationalism and how national concerns can be connected to a broader discussion. In 2 years' time, in 2023, 2024, it will be the centenary, 100 years from the Greek-Turkish exchange of populations. I remind you that the Greek-Turkish exchange of populations was a radical way to resolve the population mixing of the Ottoman Empire, where all Muslim inhabitants of Greece were obliged to go to Turkey, to the Republic of Turkey, and all Orthodox subjects of the Turkish Republic, this is 1922, 1923, were obliged to move to Greece. There were some notable exceptions to this rule, but it was an exchange of populations where you didn't have any option of saying no. You had to go. You had to go to a country that would host you on the basis of religious lines. This centenary and the fact that we're witnessing a new era of Greek-Turkish antagonism has brought to the forefront a new version of identity politics, where the third generation of refugees originating from the 1920s are demanding a status of victimization, or they're demanding a legal status that will allow them to present themselves as the eternal victims of Islam, Turkey, and imperialist politics in general. The impact of this question on Greek politics can be illustrated with the following example. In 2012, for the first time, the Greek parliament was ready to incorporate a provision regarding Holocaust deniers. It was seen as a step towards the normalization of Greek understanding of the Holocaust, and the Greek parliament was ready to vote for this. A number of representatives in the parliament, coming from the traditional right wing and from the far right, did not challenge the politics of regarding Holocaust deniers, but they added a clause that would make the 1922-1923 experience of Greek refugees in Asia Minor, Orthodox subjects of Asia Minor, as equivalent to the Jewish communities in Greece that suffered during the Holocaust. So it was a way of promoting a Greek story of a Holocaust, of a genocide, that would matter equally, and you do understand the implications for that this carries, because the Greek trauma of the 1920s is as important as the Jewish trauma of the 1940s. And the Greek parliament approved this law, and this is a law that if I publicly challenge the idea of a Holocaust or a genocide in Turkey in 1922, under this law, I can be persecuted. It is still there. Why is this not just a Greek story? Because the additional factor that makes this, creates the conditions for a much more complicated and geographically entangled story is that we have a recent interest of Russian politics in this question of identity, of refugees, of the unmixing of populations during the 1920s. So it serves three, there's a connection to the recent refugee crisis. So the refugees of today are not welcome, whereas the real refugees are us, Greeks of the 1920s. It makes a connection to the anti-Islamic agenda that we suffered from the Ottomans in the 1920s. We're still suffering because Erdogan is instrumentalizing refugees now and is violating Greek borders. And historical revisionism here becomes important because it opens a door to the Russian influence that was expressed, that is consistent in Greece, that makes a connection that the only supporters of the Greek nation in this struggle is the Russian nation that is fighting the Black Sea, the question of Donbass, Ukraine, is again fighting against the eternal enemy. This connection, and I'm afraid I wasn't able to make the connection very to illustrate it, but there are organizational ties. I can refer to this if we have a discussion. Were evident in the protests against the Prespa agreement. Those that were against the Prespa agreement and would take the streets in northern Greece, up to a great extent, were second and third generation refugees of the 1920s that feel that Macedonia is, because they arrived in the 1920s, is their land and is disputed by the northern Macedonia. And at that point, Russian influence was instrumental in organizing, supporting, and creating let's say, an atmosphere of international solidarity for the voice of Greek nationalists. So it's the connection between this refugee story of the 1920s, historical revisionism, and an idea of Orthodox solidarity that is based on a historical reenactment or a definition of a defense of this historical reenactment of the 1920s, I think is one of the most alarming signs of this, what we're trying to trace, not just the organizational ties between small groups of true believers, but this creation of networks of solidarity where there are fuzzy lines between geopolitics and activism and identity politics. I know that this sounds a bit abstract, but trust me, it's happening. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Kostis. I don't think at all it's abstract, and many things we can also envisage, at least here in Serbia. It was interesting when you were mentioning migration and when you were mentioning swapping the population. I mean, that was not so old and historic concept, because that was also present as a part of programs, ideological programs of during the Yugoslav wars. I mean, how to exchange population, and even it was not accepted formally, it was happening informally, because many people who moved from war zone moved somewhere else and settled as on the land which was well, state land, because in Yugoslavia everything was state land, but that definitely it happened in practice. I would now move to Sasha to say a little bit more about youth, because she was preparing to speak a little bit about the study which Friedrich Ebert was doing in this context. And then I would give the floor to Ivan Vejvoda, having in mind that he has a global perspective and a lot of experience in fighting all this during his career. I would like to finish this round with him. So first Sasha and then Ivan.
Thank you, Gazela. Hello, everyone. My name is Sasha. We didn't have a chance to meet before. I'm a project officer at the Friedrich Ebert Foundation Southeast Dialogue. And today I'm going to talk, as Gazela said, about the youth study, regional youth study, Southeast Europe, that FES commissioned in 2018. I don't know if you had a chance to look at the study, but this comprehensive study encompasses main findings on attitudes, values, and concerns of young people within 10 countries from the region. 10,000 young people from age 14 to 29 were part of this survey. The survey covers a broad range of issues relating to young people's experience and aspirations in different realms of life, such as employment, mobility, family life, political participation. And today I will just briefly introduce you to some basic issues. And of course, I will touch upon these topics that we are talking about today. So in the study reveal obvious fact that young people in the region face challenging transitions to adulthood. They have a difficult access to labor market. If they have a work, they tend to work in precarious conditions. For example, in Albania, just 25% of young people who are not employed, are not in school, are not engaged in any type of training. Informality appears to be a constant in their life. A significant number of youth recognize their educational system to be corrupt, and they also show tolerance toward informal practices. Youth, particularly from Western Balkan 6 countries, they have a great willingness to leave their countries. 75% of youngsters from Western Balkan region want to leave that region for economic reasons. And of course, social inequalities infuses all aspects of young people's life. Regarding the far right and identity politics, there is the whole subsection in this study talking about the youth socio-political values and attitudes. And I can briefly introduce you this segment. Basically, the main finding in this session is that young people want to live in a country which, above all, guarantees them basic human rights and realistic chances for securing a long-term economic existence. On the other hand, least important appear to be issues that are more abstract, such as rule of law, equality, individual freedom. In Serbia, less than 15% of young people said that individual freedom is important value for them. While on the other hand, 50% of them said that the most important thing is basically employment and state welfare. When we talk about the strong state, the idea of strong state ensuring a decent living for all citizens is almost universally accepted among youth. This idea is even more accepted than the idea of democracy as a representative political system. So it's not surprised that the strong welfare state enjoys overwhelmingly support, especially among youth with a lower socioeconomic position. But what is surprised that the idea of having a strong welfare state is not just identified within the self-assessed left-wing politically oriented young people. It is the idea that we can also find within the right-wing political oriented young people. So they correlate positively with that strong welfare state. When we talk about basic political orientation of youth in Southeast Europe, it is evident that the youth from socioeconomically developed countries tend to be more liberal, which is a case of Slovenia, while youth from Bulgaria express a very strong right-wing political orientation with pronounced nationalism. I can share with you later a graph. I can send it to Harun so he can distribute to you. Interesting graph that shows all these countries where you from this regional country stands on a basic political orientation. And from this graph, you can see that the youth from Bosnia and Herzegovina are in favor of having a strong leader ruling a country with some kind of dictatorship. While in Serbia, most of the youth declare themselves as leftists, which is also for me, you know, having and knowing the context of this region is strange. With the considerable variation between countries, religion continues to be a very important social factor among youth in the region. During the last decade, religiosity has substantially increased among the youth in Albania, Macedonia, Montenegro, and Serbia, while it has become substantially more privatized in Bosnia and Herzegovina, Kosovo, and Romania. Croatia and Slovenia are the only countries with more general secularization tendencies. This is what study shows. Also, there is a graph that shows difference between countries in terms of patriotism and ethno-nationalism. And we can say that from that graph, you can say that youth from Bulgaria and Albania would prefer, majority of youth, would prefer to live in a country with only one ethnic group. Like in Bulgaria, 65% of young people said that they would prefer to live with one ethnic group. That number in Bosnia and Herzegovina is 22%, and the lowest percentage we found it in Slovenia, which is 70%. When we talk about the social tolerance in relation to sexual and reproductive practices, youth in Montenegro, Albania, and Bosnia and Herzegovina expressed a substantially lower tolerance of homosexuality. Basically, we don't have any tolerance toward the LGBT group. So just for end, I'm not gonna take it long. Not all results are so gray and bleak. Findings show that youth across the region strongly identifies themselves as a European. And they place relatively great trust in European institutions. They actually trust more institutions of European Union than their own country's national institutions. And the membership in the EU enjoys strong and increased support. I just want to say that this project will continue. So FES will probably commission another regional study in year 2022-23. So it will be interesting to see the trends, you know, in 4 years, what changed, what hasn't changed. And so it's a really, it's a great study. It has a lot of data, and these are just some things that I could, you know, extract from. So that's it.
Thanks a lot, Sasha. This was very valuable to see what is, and I'm now going to even European futures. Actually, what are young people who are usually named, although they hate sometimes be named as a future of the society. They are now in the society and they would like to influence it. But this was a great overview, and I think it's very relevant to point out that they perceive themselves as Europeans. There is a huge potential still in the region for Europe as a concept to come back in a way in a big door. And but also it's very worrying for us to have to see these tendencies toward ethnic monolithism, and it tells us a lot about also education, and a lot about media context, and a lot about what is happening in the countries. And I think this is something which we have to have in mind when we are thinking what to do, not only what is the situation. This was a great overview, what is the situation, but it's very difficult to think what to do and how to do things, because we have a lot of mixtures here. And now I'm coming finally to Ivan, who rescued us as institute Serbia by accepting to be the president of the governing board of the Institute for Philosophy and Social Theory. Thank you, Ivan, once more for that. But he is really a prominent figure who was one of the key actors of the civil society here in Serbia, but also I would say in the region during 90s when he was chairing, he was director of the Fund for Open Society. After that, he was also vice president of German Marshall Fund. So he has a lot really experience in relations between the region and the West. And this is something having in mind that you are now leading the program, which is called European Futures at EVM. I think it would be really relevant, really interesting for us all to hear some, let's say, wrap of your thinking of everything what you heard here, and also your own thinking how to approach to this topic, and especially having in mind that we all see, and this is frequently in the public, especially in the academic public, that generally society is turned towards right more. So the center moved to the right. So what to do to move?
Thank you very much, Gazela, for your kind words. And I'd like to say that it's a hard act to follow Anna Nenad, Kostis and Sasha, who were extremely interesting, and both by their expertise in this field. So I learned a lot and found obviously a lot of elements that I myself have been thinking of. And in addition to everything that Gazela said, I'm also a political scientist and a political theorist, and hopefully also my present life, not only my past academic life. I'd just like to reflect for 2 seconds on the research on the youth, which I believe is extremely important, and everything that Sasha said, I think, reveals kind of the deeper, I would simply say, common sense of the majority of people and young people. We know that there is huge support for the European Union in all countries, in Hungary, in Poland, just because they see it as a bulwark, as a possible firewall if everything goes completely wrong with the governments that they have. And in the case of our region, it's, you know, hoping for a future where the European Union can be that firewall, that bulwark, that protection from sombering into worse times. I'll give a few disjointed thoughts, and as you asked me, Gazela, try to make some general remarks, but I wanted to also say what Kostis brought up, which is extremely relevant, the whole Greek example and the 100th anniversary that is coming forward. But we all remember that 2 Russian diplomats were expelled from Greece in 2018 in the middle of the negotiations on the Prespa agreement. And that is simply because, and I'm sure that many of us have heard, as I have from Greek friends, the amount of Russian meddling, of Russian cash that was going to football groups, to the elements of the church. And you are right, Gazela, to say that the church is a big organization where there are multiple voices, no matter what the patriarchy says itself. And I think that's an important element when we want to sort of see the finer points and developments in the churches of the region. So the Greek North Macedonian example, I think, is very pertinent to the subject that we are looking here. Russia, to repeat everything that we know, is going to try and impede Euro-Atlantic integration of this region. They know that eventually they cannot stop it, but they can delay it. They can slow it down. They can make it complicated and messy, and they can make it such that many people start asking themselves the question, does Europe want us? To put it as simply as that. And of course, the European kind of reflection on this, Macron's red light on Macedonia and Albania last October were unfortunately water to the mill of those who are suspicious of Europe wanting to stop enlargement and wanting to keep the Western Balkans at bay, and that was not good. So I think this whole argument, you know, that we have heard endlessly for the past 30 years, Europe needs to deepen before it widens, is simply silly. These things happen at the same time, and there's plenty of time for deepening because no country in the Western Balkans is ready for enlargement, at least in the next 5 to 6 to 7 years at earliest. So I think that's a vacuous discussion to have. Clearly, the role, and this is a point that I think is important to make, that's again very obvious, the leaderships of these countries are responsible for a lot that goes on in the field of the far right. The fact that they are not reacting or reacting weakly or reacting sporadically gives space to this activity. So we cannot exonerate whoever is in government, whether we like them or not. And as several of my colleagues have said, governments, I think Nenad was saying that, are using these groups. We know for a fact that several of these groups were created by governments to be sort of the far right that we don't want. As an example, you know, you want them, better vote for us, etc. So that's an important element. I think probably better suited for the first discussion yesterday than for this one, but I think it needs to be repeated that there are elements of self-creation of these by governments of these groups themselves. And then the Russian funding. I mean, much has been said. I don't need to repeat it. The government in Serbia, as we all know, accused the Russians of interfering in the demonstrations that were held after the announcement of a new lockdown, which was interesting in and of itself. A government doesn't do this simply to invent something. Clearly, there has been, as we all know, Russian meddling in this general scheme of trying to stop forward movement. Now we can elaborate on elements of that and how this was used or not, but there is clear interference, and I would like to add to this. And in the case of Greece, it was more visible of the use of Russian tycoons and businessmen with a lot of money. People like Ivan Savidis and others, but Kostis will correct me on this, had an important role of, if one could put, middlemen in these affairs. I'd also here like to add something that we haven't mentioned, and that is sort of far left, far rightism or sovereignism. I think of someone like Jean-Luc Mélenchon in France, who, if you didn't know that he was on the left, just by listening to him, you'd think he was on the right. This very sovereigntist, autarkic, we can do by ourselves. We don't need the European Union. We French have a grand history, heroic history. What is this European flag? When he entered the Assemblée Nationale in Paris for the first time, he said, why is this flag flying here? I fear that on the left, we have these elements as well, and that we need to be very, I think, judicious in analyzing how maybe part of that left-wing sovereignism, which is basically an autarkism, is playing into some of that, the classical theme that the extremes meet at some point at the other end of the circle. I'd just like to remind us, and I'm sure most of you know, the very useful book by our colleague Anton Chekhovtsov, Russia and the Western Far Right, Tango Noir, which I think has a lot of information, obviously on the relations with the Western Far Right, but applicable, I think, in instances, and he refers to some elements here as well. More generally, I think what is clear with the crisis of the Western or the global economy, the crisis of globalization, there has been a loss of bearings for a lot of people. If you have your regular salary, if you go to work every day and you can afford yourself a decent meal and 2 weeks holiday, people don't really have too much worries. They may be unhappy, but sort of life goes on. With the economic crisis, I think a lot of questions were raised about the way things are. People sense that there's this global governments that they are unable to change with voting in elections in their countries or local elections. And you add on top of that, the migration crisis, what was happening then with Russia, and then the pandemic. And I think people in that situation of despair, of loss of jobs, not to mention the broader question about the future of work, and people questioning themselves, will the next automated machine in my factory leave me without a job, and what do I do after that? All of these create a sense of kind of Weltschmerz in a kind of more practical, and people then turn to these what the American calls the snake oil sellers, the people who are selling solutions that are non-solutions. And the far right, historically, unfortunately, has been very successful in capturing on those opportunities. Final point, of course, much more to say. We also have a problem because, when people are looking for where do they find solutions, we have the absolute loss of solidarity. And unfortunately, this group of the Frugal Four or the Frugal Five, which is absolutely extraordinary. There are 3 social democratic governments that were part or are part of this frugal group: Sweden, Denmark, and Finland, who have social democratic governments. You know, où va le monde? You know, where is the world going? If we have social democrats who have lost that basic instinct and principle of modern society, I would add, not only of a socially responsible government. And so the loss of the mainstream on the left has created an open space for kind of center right is the polite word, but then far right movements of this sort. And again, we unfortunately in Southeastern Europe, as the theme of this conversation goes, are part of a broader movement. There are influences from various sides that are coming. But I say it is, you know, up to us to fight this back, both in academic, intellectual, but also in political terms. Thank you.
Thank you, Ivan. Your final words were crucial for all of us here, I would say. Yes, we need to fight back, but it's also the question how to fight and what resources we have at our disposal to fight. This is one of the very important pieces of the puzzle for having that. But also, I have to say, if someone who is also engaged in this fight, it's somehow difficult also to have people who will fight with you. And I think this fall of the left, not only in our region, of course, it's a more global phenomenon, it's European phenomena, is also due to the loss of faith that we can actually change things. And on one side, but also on another side, it's a commodity we have in our European societies when we compare ourselves to others. Even in our relatively poor, when we compare to Europe, Western Balkan societies are poor societies, but still somehow there is satisfaction with and I think that the study which Sasha presented actually said that most of the young people are satisfied, which is completely in opposition with everything else which they said about their lives. But this satisfaction somehow prevents us from acting and trying to change. And having in mind all this and having in mind everything which you all said, I think there are several things which maybe we can discuss. And for the beginning, as a moderator, I will abuse that role here. For me, there is one thing which was mentioned across all, several presentations here. Nenad, also Kostis, but also you, even Church. And somehow, especially when we are having in mind progressive forces and left-wing forces, we usually see that there is a very, very strong distance, which is, of course, understandable distance over the church, because church is usually very conservative institution in all societies. But also, can we somehow count and can we somehow try to maybe understand and try to ally ourselves with some groups within the church which maybe can help us in our efforts? Is it possible? Not when I say church, I mean all religious communities, so not to mean only Orthodox and Catholic Church or Protestant, but also I think of the Islamic community here. Is it possible to have someone from these religious communities to work with us? As we all see that the church is very strong. I mean, recent Montenegrin case show us very much the importance of the religious issues, at least, and somehow we tend to neglect them completely on the left and try to but we really stand on the stance that this is nationalistic, this is right-wing, this is conservative, this is something which doesn't have anything with the left, which is secular, which is modern, which is progressive, which I, of course, understand fully. But having in mind a reality here, and having in mind that a lot of people still care about religious values, religious issues, is there anything we might use to fight back from this also real? This is just a general question for the beginning, but also I invite you all to problematize everything which you have heard so far. Anna. Yes, it's not an easy, definitely. Please.
It's not an easy question, but I would just like to not to answer really the question, but to say that, you know, there is numerous surveys that show over the past 3 decades that actually people are not very religious. And of course, it really depends on the setup of the questionnaire and whether you're actually doing it as a yes or no, or answering questions on the scale, or whether you actually have enough money to get funding to ask people to talk about it. It's a huge difference. And whoever worked with agencies that actually conduct survey, it all depends on whether you agree on the number of questions and what is possible as some kind of middle ground. But to still make some conclusion about it, people are not terribly religious, but those questions that deal with the importance of churches as symbols of statehood, as symbols of national culture, they are treated completely separately from the answers. And, you know, you do it when you do, you know, crossing the answers. They exist in separate realms. And I'm saying this just because it may be misleading to conclude or to propose that we should have some kind of special new forms of cooperation with the church. So this is one concern. The other concern is that, again, over the decades, and in our region since the beginning of the wars of the 90s, again, numerous agencies contributed funding to establishing various so-called interfaith dialogues. You know, this is already a token word. You know, interfaith dialogues have been funded over 30 years, and there are always a number of good guys in every religious denomination, and they come together. We have token Franciscans talk. Usually, you know, you have them in the Catholic Church. You have them in kind of their special enclaves from which you can invite a particular a friar or a person of another religious rank, and they would be very glad to talk about the history of interreligious dialogue, the long history of peaceful cohabitation, and we all know the script. And again, you have members of the Islamic community and possible renegade Orthodox priests. Renegade in terms of just to think about the people who during the Kosovo War actually helped sheltering Kosovo Albanians from the actions of that resulted in the expulsions of Kosovo Albanians, mass expulsions during that the NATO bombing. So the question is, like, what do we do with this? To what extent it is worth to kind of do a setup of the dialogues that include or polylogues that include religious functionaries that would allow us to kind of move beyond what we have already done? I don't know, but I think it's important to bear in mind what already has been done in terms of involving religious functionaries.
Thanks a lot, Anna. Yes, I'm very familiar with making a questionnaires and how difficult it might be. And yes, you're right that our societies or our populations were not particularly religious, but there is importance of religious as part of the national identity, which we saw basically in a way, and it's used very frequently here as a distinction between national identities. Even, you know, when we say about, when we are talking and when we're discussing about Kosovo, it's usually, I mean, it's not usually, but you see in this narrative which we have seen after this negotiation in Washington and everything, that Kosovo was labeled as an Islamic state in a way. I mean, it's really, even the Albanians are not only Islam community. I mean, they're Catholic, they're Orthodox also, and they always emphasize that there are multi-religious nation, this was something as a label, basically, put on them. And that's why that was one of my thinking, why we should think about also religion when we think how to fight back far right. But let's move on. Do you have any other insights into this, what we have heard, how to deal with the far right? Yes, better.
Thanks a lot. What I did in the first session is taking notes, and now I have 6 more pages, adding to the 5 from the first session, which is 11. But as I started my moderation in the first session with referring to the Austrian Freedoms Party and its far right positions, I just wanted yet again to bring it up by just need to close the window. That was no one from the far right. That was probably someone from the far left in a Porsche. No, I'm joking. No, but the more serious moment is, as we all know, we talked about the German-Serbian connection. We talked about the Serbian-Russian connections. We dig into the Greece case. But one of the most prominent in the last years was this kind of a big brother connection between Austrian Strache and Gudenus and then Republic of Srpska in Serbia. So both Strache and Gudenus invested a lot, both in terms of building up political capital here, connecting or reconnecting with Russia. So what Kostis says, that was not a highway in one direction, but that was a kind of a Russia, Serbia, Republic of Srpska, Austria, and then going further to Germany. Kind of a highway leading in 2 ways. But what's particularly interesting, and because Gazela mentioned the moment of fighting, and Ivan also underlined the need to confront the far right, both discourse and practices, is basically the fact, and that shows basically the post-Ibiza time. Both Strache and Gudenus, and the Freedom Party thought, as well as Dodik probably was quite convinced that this is the new setup to stay. This is the new power game. After the migration and or so-called refugee crisis. And then came Ibiza, and then it exposed basically that those far-right international networks are basically very fragile, and that they risk the potential that they can have in terms of capturing the dissatisfactions, as Ivan said, or being basically powerful in shaping the discourse, that they basically lose it when they start running the country, when they enter the government. This is what happened to the Freedoms Party for the second time. So first time they entered the government 2000 with Jörg Haider, who was one of the leading figures of the pan-European far right, and now it happened for the second time. So basically, the question that I wanted to raise is once again, I mean, when we keep that in mind, this kind of a fragility of the far right. That might be also a question for Kostis, because as you described, the Golden Dawn went down. But then the question is, even if those like dominant structures are exposed and become fragile, what's the ground underneath? And what's the mobilizing potential underneath that remains? I mean, Sasha also told us the figures from the FEST study, and we see that there is a potential to capture this dissatisfaction and or false satisfaction of the youth. And now looking into the post-COVID, hopefully sometimes post-COVID time, as we discussed in the first session, as we assume that the far right has not managed to profit that much so far, but we can assume that they will come back. So basically, what could be? I mean, it's just my question to Kostis. So because you are facing a similar development right now, do you see? I mean, Freedom's Party is trying to come back, even though they have a hard time to come back, as Kurz has captured the middle and has moved towards the right. So, but what's going on in Greece? And generally, I believe this is an important line of thinking when we think about the right-wing international.
All right. I think this concept of fragility is an excellent one. And I was thinking the moment you mentioned fragility, if we see all these international structures of the far right, they cannot be compared to the historical, let's say, structures of the transnational, international left. Because the question of national priorities at the end of the day creates a contradiction that cannot be resolved. I mean, we have this historical discussion about the networks. This is why we're talking about networks, about meetings. There's not a structure like the Communist International of the 1920s and 30s and 40s, early 40s, because the national question is creates this contradiction between parties. At the same time, I think we have seen the fragility of certain, let's say, groups or parties in a national context and how they revive in different forms. I would like to make a final comment regarding this Greek-Russian connection, just to make it more, to convince you that it exists on the one hand, and then this might answer the question about fragility. In the early 1990s, Greece received some hundreds of thousands of refugees from the former Soviet Union. They were the Greeks of the Black Sea that they would repatriate, even though they had never been to Greece. They came here as a process of repatriation. And they were granted the Greek status, Greek identity from day one. They were socially marginalized. They would vote for the social democratic or so-called social democratic PASOK in the 1990s because that was the party that would handle the question of integration in Greek society. And now they form the backbone of this new wave of the far right that is connected to what Ivan mentioned, the Greek-Russian tycoons dominating northern Greece. My football team, PAOK, is under this ownership of Ivan Savvidis, who is the guy channeling the money for against the Prespes agreement. And the people following this are Greeks of Russian descent that are here since the early 1990s. They support PAOK, they support Ivan Savvidis. Their voice is a voice that possibly one can detect an electoral pattern of the far right, but can definitely detect a pattern of far right politics. So I think, despite all the transformations of Golden Dawn, the crisis of the Golden Dawn, and the different forms of political representation of this, this is the one level of analysis. If we go to the social level, we will see how these ideas survive, revive, and sometimes they are not identified. And here I agree again with Ivan, with what we traditionally understand as the far right. Just to give you an example, Dugin, that Anna was mentioning, his visit to Serbia, was invited in Greece by the former foreign minister of the Syriza party and the guy who signed the Prespa agreement, Nikos Kotzias. And Nikos Kotzias hosted, when he was teaching at the University of Piraeus, he hosted Dugin to give a lecture on geopolitics and in the late 1990s. So I think that the Greek society, as all societies, illustrate, the limits of an analysis that looks at the polling station and understands the influence of the far right only through the parliamentary lens. The agenda of the far right is dominating public discussion when it comes to the question of refugees, to the question of immigrants, to the question of Greek-Turkish relations, just to keep the discussion in the Greek context. And this is not, the major challenge is to see to what extent our response either comes as as an abstract response that, oh, the far right is something bad, or sometimes our forces, our resources, as Gazella mentioned, contain elements of this understanding of the world. Anti-imperialism is very close to the politics of this far right response to geopolitical developments here.
thank you both, Vedran and Kostis. Yes, we always somehow come back to the imperialism, anti-imperialism, and in a way capitalist relations, which help spreading this right-wing politics. And although Vedran, you mentioned that these relations, international relations, transnational relations between right-wing are somehow fragile, I think that also left side of these transnationalist relations are also very fragile, very weak. I mean, we have seen some attempts of creation of transnational actors, let's call it like that, in DM25 or some other internationals, but without major impact, basically. So in a way, we are still playing in the national politics, in a way, in this way or another way, and we are playing with capitalist relations, which are transnational. So this is the context which we are talking about, and this is something which we might think as we have to take as a factor when we are discussing also what to do and how to fight back right wing. Okay, if there is any more comments. No, then I would give a floor, since we are, yes, Anna, please. You're muted.
I clicked twice, sorry. I just, this word anti-imperialism that Kostis mentions just kind of really is ringing in my head, because I think you didn't finish really talking about this. So I think it's a very important in what the right-wing leadership markets as also as anti-globalism, as the protection, but always the protection of weaker states. So it is part of that sovereignism. And I think the way to criticize is precisely from the standard position, but somehow in need of revival position of the left. And that is that in no way is there anti-imperialism really substantively touching on the issue of solidarity. So they are talking about anti-imperialism as a fight for sovereignty of the weaker states that need the protection of the stronger states. So, you know, even that anti-imperialism is kind of very questionable, right? It can be anti-imperialism on the one side, but it can be seeking the protection of more benevolent states that would not call themselves having an imperial quest. On the other hand, they never really talk about issues of solidarity. They do not have in their vocabulary any kind of rich treatment of capitalism. It's really not part of their interest. So to what extent this anti-imperialism is a plausible thing, I think there is plenty of ground for the left to attack. Just to give one very kind of small but still very relevant example, when recently manual workers that were imported from India to Serbia, when they went on strike because they had 2 of their salaries withheld, and they literally couldn't eat for several weeks because the larger parts of their salaries were actually paid to their families in India according to the contract, and they could barely survive in Serbia. And so Serbian audiences learned about their presence only because about 100 of them went on strike. So only the local, some local unions in communication with the unions in India could actually come to the rescue of these workers. So I'm just giving this seemingly very small example in terms of how some transnational networks are successful, and they focus on issues of the protection of labor, for example. And this is also the way of kind of exposing the lack of genuine interest on the part of the transnational right in the rights of the working people.
Yes, you're fully right on that, and you reminded me actually on one of the recent, recent few years ago, Michael Walzer, who considered himself as a leftist, also was writing a piece called "A Foreign Policy for the Left," and he was debating about using the force because he's dealing with just war and the theory of just war, but still it was really interesting it would be really interesting to see more debate on how leftists in general, left side could intervene, and what is the line they would like to follow in the foreign relations, because if we are, and when I say foreign relations, it automatically implies that there are nation states which have relations, and how to transcend this, in what direction we should go. That's very rarely debated, I have to say, and we usually limit ourselves to, if not nation state, then union of the nation states like European Union is. So there is very rarely a wider spectrum of discussion on this issue, which can maybe help in this framework. Okay. If there are no further points, I would like to give a word back to Harun as our host here. And thank you on behalf of myself and the whole team which was behind this on participating in this round. We have one more, and Harun will say more about this in next words. We can't hear you, Harun.
Sorry, I was muted. So thank you, Gazela, and thank you everybody for your contributions. I think we had a really interesting discussion today, maybe a little bit less academic than last time, based more on facts, and then on things on the ground, like the connection with the governments, as Nenad and Ivan also mentioned, and the influences of various religious institutions and their connections to the far right. So I think it was also for the general public and our viewers on Facebook a very interesting and a very important topic. And next week, to make it brief, next week. Next Friday or this Friday, we will talk about strategies and tools that the far right in the Southeastern Europe, but also in Europe in general, use. So I think we are also looking forward to a very good discussion, and hopefully everybody will be able also to join us on Friday. So thank you very much, and have a nice day, the rest of the day.
See you on Friday. Bye-bye.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye.